The future is for the African continent. The African continent will be the powerhouse of global growth. So let us work together, let us put our energies together and move forward. And I thank you.
The new chairman of the African Union Commission just landed in Ouagadougou. Mahmoud Ali Yusuf, fresh mandate, diplomatic smile, full delegation, and Burkina Faso's government received him with the kind of courtesy that does not hide what is actually being said underneath it. The message from the Prime Minister's side was not wrapped in diplomatic language. The African Union does not feel independent. It does not truly stand up for African sovereignty. And a continent that is bleeding from terrorism, from economic extraction, from the consequences of 60 years of manufactured dependency, cannot afford a continental body that holds meetings funded by the same foreign institutions whose interests those meetings are supposed to challenge. This is not a minor diplomatic friction between Ouagadougou and Addis Ababa. This is Burkina Faso saying loudly, clearly on the record that the organization built to unite and defend Africa has a credibility problem so fundamental that it threatens the entire project of continental sovereignty. And if the AU does not fix it, countries like Burkina Faso will simply keep moving without it. You need to watch this to the end, because what Burkina Faso is saying about the AU is what every African leader privately thinks but nobody says publicly. And understanding it changes how you see every AU summit, every suspension decision, and every statement issued from Addis Ababa about African sovereignty. Walk into the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa and look at what is on the walls. Agenda 2063.
The review of the first 10-year implementation plan. We've had a decade of Agenda 2063, and we're focused on the priorities of Africa's agenda. So this meeting was directed at reviewing, at considering the review report, but also preparing for the second 10-year implementation plan.
The aspiration for a prosperous and united Africa, the vision of a continent that speaks with one voice, defends its own interests and builds its future on its own terms. Now look at who is paying for the building. The African Union's program budget, the funding that covers the actual work of peace and security, development programs and institutional operations, has historically depended on external donors for between 60 and 70% of its financing. The European Union, individual European member states, the United States, international institutions whose own strategic interests in Africa are not always aligned with the continental sovereignty that Agenda 2063 declares as its organizing principle. This is not a secret. It is documented in AU financial reports that member states receive and acknowledge without apparent urgency to change. And the consequence of this funding architecture is not abstract. It is visible in every decision the AU makes about when to act decisively and when to issue a careful statement that offends nobody while resolving nothing. The suspension of Mali in June 2021, within weeks of the military transition. The suspension of Burkina Faso in February 2022. The suspension of Niger in August 2023. All executed with a speed and decisiveness that the AU has never demonstrated when responding to the kind of governance failures, corruption, electoral manipulation, externally driven economic exploitation that created the conditions for those transitions in the first place. The pattern is not coincidental. The AU moves fast when the targets of its action are governments that have broken from the foreign partnerships that its donor base prefers to maintain. It moves slowly or not at all when the governance failures it is supposed to address are happening inside governments that those same donors support. Burkina Faso has been living on the receiving end of this pattern, and it has reached the limit of its patience. The physical object that anchors this story is not a building or a piece of infrastructure. It is a chair, specifically the chair at the AU table that Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger have been told they cannot occupy because of suspension decisions made by an organization that lectures Africa about sovereignty while surviving on checks from institutions that profit from African dependency. That empty chair is the most honest symbol of what the AU has become in 2026. Not because the AES nations have been excluded from a powerful institution that was effectively defending their interess, because the institution that excluded them has demonstrated through its funding structure, its selective enforcement record, and its chronic inability to deliver decisive support to member states fighting genuine existential security threats that the chair was not offering what it appeared to offer anyway. Burkina Faso is fighting terrorism daily, real terrorism, not the kind that generates diplomatic statements and peacekeeping mission proposals that take 18 months to deploy, the kind that attacks airports, that sends armed convoys into garrison towns at dawn, that plants vehicle bombs outside generals' residences and kills their families along with them. And the AU's response to this existential security crisis facing one of its member states, suspension, followed by periodic visits from Commission officials who arrive with talking points about constitutional order and democratic transition timelines. The Prime Minister's office in Ouagadougou does not need to shout this frustration. It simply states it: the AU does not feel independent. 4 words, precise, devastating, and backed by the documented financial reality of an organization that cannot tell its largest donors they are wrong about anything consequential without risking the funding that keeps its headquarters operational. But here is where the tension deepens beyond the obvious critique of donor dependency. Because the AU's problem is not just financial, it is architectural. The organization meets at the heads of state level once per year, foreign ministers twice, specialized committees several times more, each meeting generating communiques, frameworks, aspiration documents, and implementation plans that the next meeting will assess the progress of in a cycle of institutional process that is internally coherent and externally irrelevant to the populations whose crises are unfolding faster than any annual summit cycle can address. Burkina Faso watches this machinery operate. It watches the AU hold extraordinary summits for crises that the ordinary summit cycle cannot accommodate. It watches specialized technical committees produce reports on security threats that the Peace and Security Council will discuss at its next session. It watches the process produce outputs, statements, frameworks, resolutions, while the situation on the ground produces casualties. And it draws the only conclusion that the evidence supports. An institution this process-heavy, this donor-dependent, and this structurally cautious cannot be the primary vehicle for the kind of decisive, sovereignty-first continental action that the current moment demands. Therefore, Burkina Faso builds its own vehicle. The Alliance of Sahel States is not a rejection of Pan-Africanism. It is a rejection of the specific institutional form that Pan-Africanism has taken in an organization that has allowed its funding architecture to compromise its independence and its process architecture to compromise its speed. The AES moves at the speed of the threat it faces. The AU moves at the speed of its donor relationships and its committee calendar. These are not compatible operating tempos for the same crisis. The visit of AU Commission Chair Mahmoud Ali Yusuf to Ouagadougou in July 2026 is significant precisely because of what it represents institutionally. This is not a routine diplomatic courtesy call. This is the AU's new leadership making an early signal that it wants to re-engage with the AES nations to find a path toward normalization that reduces the institutional damage of having 3 member states effectively operating outside the continental body's orbit. And Burkina Faso receives this signal with both hands, not because it has softened its critique of what the AU has become, but because the critique itself contains an implicit offer: reform or get ignored. That is not a door being slammed. That is a door being held open, with conditions attached that any serious institutional reform agenda could theoretically meet. The AU Commission Chair sits across the table from Burkinabe officials who have spent 3 years building a parallel security and economic architecture, precisely because the continental body failed to provide what they needed. What does he offer that the existing AES framework does not already provide? This is the question that Ouagadougou is asking, not rhetorically but operationally, not as a negotiating position but as a genuine institutional assessment. The AU brings continental legitimacy. The symbolic weight of 55 member states speaking with a unified voice carries diplomatic currency that the AES, 3 nations, however determined, cannot fully replicate on its own. But legitimacy without independence is performance, and Burkina Faso has had enough of continental performance dressed as continental solidarity. The new AU Commission chair arrives in Ouagadougou with a mandate that is newer than the grievances he is being asked to address. Whether his mandate is fresh enough, whether the institutional will exists within the AU to make the structural changes that would make its independence credible to governments that have documented its compromises in detail, is the question that this visit opens without resolving. Here is what changes if the AU takes Burkina Faso's critiques seriously, not the diplomatic language of taking it seriously, the institutional action of taking it seriously. Genuine financial independence from external donors requires African member states to fully fund the continental body themselves. The AU has been trying to implement a 0.2% levy on eligible imports from member states to generate domestic funding. Progress has been slow. Political will has been inconsistent. The result is an institution that continues to depend on foreign checks while formally committing to independence in documents that nobody enforces. Full funding from member states changes the institutional incentive structure completely. An AU that does not depend on European funding to operate cannot be pressured by European diplomatic preferences in the same way. An AU whose Peace and Security Council is financed by African contributions rather than external grants can make security assessments without reference to what its donors think about the political character of the governments under threat. This is not idealism, it is institutional design, and Burkina Faso, sitting with its 5.3% economic growth rate, its state-owned gold mine, its sovereign debt instruments, its patriotic loan that raised 151 billion CFA francs from its own citizens, is in a stronger position to make this argument in 2026 than it was in 2022. Government that has demonstrated it can fund its own development without foreign aid is a government whose critique of donor-dependent continental institutions carries the credibility of demonstrated alternative. The empty chair at the AU table that Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger have been occupying through their suspensions is not a chair that the AES is desperate to reclaim. It is a chair that the AU is increasingly motivated to offer back, because the alternative is a continental body that becomes progressively less relevant as the most consequential security and sovereignty developments on the continent happen outside its institutional framework. Mahmoud Ali Yusuf leaves Ouagadougou with something more valuable than a diplomatic photo opportunity. He leaves with a precise, documented, publicly stated account of exactly what an African government fighting for its survival needs from its continental institution and exactly what that institution has failed to deliver. This is not a rejection of the AU project. It is the most honest engagement with that project that any African government has offered in years. Reform the funding architecture, end the donor dependency that compromises institutional independence, match the speed of continental decision-making to the speed of the crises the continent faces, and stop suspending governments fighting terrorism while going soft on governance failures that suit your funders. Do those things, and the chair that Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger have been absent from becomes worth sitting in again. Fail to do them, and the AES will keep demonstrating, one sovereign achievement at a time, that the continental future Africa needs is being built by the nations with the courage to build it. With or without Addis Ababa's approval, the empty chair is waiting. But it will not wait forever, and the Soro Bulletin will be here to report on every development inside the AU and outside it that determines which direction the continental project goes from this moment forward. Like this video, subscribe to the Soro Bulletin, share this with every African who has ever wondered why the organization built to unite the continent keeps finding reasons to punish the countries fighting hardest for its stated values. The next chapter of this story is already being written. We will not miss it.